The guitar exploded against the amplifier, with a sound that cut through. 15,000, screaming voices like a gunshot. Kurt Cobain stood at center stage, hands still gripping the neck of what was left of his blue Fender Mustang. Breathing hard, eyes wild, the crowd thought it was part of the show. They always did. But this time was different. September 25th, 1991, the Paramount Theatre in Seattle. Nirvana was playing a hometown show just 2 weeks after Nevermind had been released into the world. Nobody yet knew that album would change everything. Nobody knew it would knock Michael Jackson off the charts. Nobody knew Kurt Cobain would become the voice of a generation, whether he wanted to be or not. That night the band was still just a local group that had made it big enough to sell out the Paramount, still close enough to their underground roots that destroying equipment felt rebellious rather than performative. Kurt had smashed guitars before. He'd thrown them, kicked them, set them on fire. It was part of the punk rock aesthetic he'd grown up with. Destruction as art, chaos as statement. The audience expected it. The promoters budgeted for it. His guitar tech kept spare instruments backstage specifically for this purpose. But on September 25th, 1991, when Kurt Cobain destroyed that particular guitar, he wasn't making a statement about punk rock, philosophy, or rebelling against rock star expectations. He was trying to kill something inside himself that he couldn't name yet, something that would eventually kill him. The show had started normally enough. The energy in the Paramount was electric. Seattle claiming one of its own. Nirvana had left town as a struggling band, barely making rent, and come back as the future of rock music. The crowd was a mixture of old-school fans who'd been following them since the Bleach days and new converts who'd heard Smells Like Teen Spirit on the radio and wanted to see what the hype was about. Kurt walked on stage wearing a striped shirt and ripped jeans, looking uncomfortable with the attention as always. Dave Grohl took his place behind the drums. Chris Novoselic strapped on his bass, and they launched into their set with the kind of raw intensity that had made them famous in the first place. For the first 40 minutes, everything was perfect. The sound was tight. The crowd was responsive. Kurt's voice, always raw and powerful, cut through the mix with an urgency that made every word feel like it mattered. They played songs from Nevermind. They played older material that the hardcore fans recognized and screamed along with. They played with the kind of unified energy that only comes from a band that's been playing together long enough to function as a single organism. Dove's drumming was thunderous, Christ's bass lines were hypnotic, and Kurt's guitar work, often overshadowed by his vocals and lyrics, was technically impressive in ways that casual listeners never noticed. But something was building beneath the surface. You could see it in the way Kurt held his body, the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched between songs, the way he avoided making eye contact with the audience even as they screamed his name. Those who knew him well, who'd watched him perform dozens of times, recognized the signs. Kurt was disappearing inside himself, going to that place he went when the weight of everything became too much. The place where the pain in his stomach that had plagued him for years met the pain in his mind that he couldn't explain to doctors or friends or even himself. Halfway through the set, during a guitar solo, Kurt's playing changed. The notes became more aggressive, more chaotic. He bent the strings until they screamed. He hammered on the frets with unnecessary force. The technical precision that had been there earlier evaporated, replaced by something raw and more violent. Dave and Chris exchanged glances but kept playing. They'd learned to follow Kurt wherever he went musically, even when he went to dark places, even when he went to places that scared them. The crowd didn't notice the shift, or if they did, they interpreted it as part of the performance, part of the grunge aesthetic. Raw emotion translated into raw sound. They screamed louder, pushed closer to the stage, fed off the energy Kurt was projecting, not understanding that it wasn't performance energy. It was something else entirely, something that had been building inside Kurt Cobain since childhood. Since his parents' divorce, shattered his sense of security. Since he'd started feeling like an outsider in his own life, since he'd discovered that even success and recognition couldn't fill whatever was missing inside him. And then something happened that nobody in the audience saw. Between songs, as the crowd cheered, and Dave adjusted his drum kit, and Chris tuned his bass, Kurt looked down at his guitar, really looked at it. This particular Fender Mustang had been with him for months. He'd used it to record parts of Nevermind. He'd played it at dozens of shows. It had become an extension of his body, the way instruments do for musicians who play them long enough. The weight of it was familiar, the way the neck sat in his left hand, the way his fingers found the frets without thinking. It was a tool he trusted, a companion in the only activity that made sense to him anymore. But in that moment, looking down at the guitar, Kurt felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation he'd felt before, but never this intensely, a feeling that everything was wrong, that the success was wrong, that the attention was wrong, that even the music, the one thing that had always made sense, was becoming corrupted by expectations and industry pressure and the weight of 1,000,000 people projecting their own meanings onto his words. The guitar in his hands suddenly felt like a chain, like a symbol of everything that was trapping him in a life he hadn't asked for and didn't know how to escape. The next song started. Kurt's fingers moved automatically through the chord progression. His voice came out on cue, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about how 2 weeks ago he'd been relatively unknown, how he could walk down a street without being recognized, how he could go to a show and just be another person in the crowd, how he could play music because he loved it, not because millions of people expected him to. And he was thinking about how in 2 weeks, or 2 months, or 2 years, when Nevermind did whatever it was going to do, all of that would be gone forever. The privacy, the anonymity, the ability to just exist without the weight of other people's expectations crushing down on every moment. The song ended, the crowd roared, and Kurt Cobain made a decision that he didn't fully understand, even as he made it. He stepped back from the microphone, adjusted his grip on the guitar neck, and with every ounce of strength in his body, he swung the instrument like a baseball bat directly into the nearest amplifier. The impact was catastrophic. The guitar's body splintered. Strings snapped with sounds like rifle shots. Pieces of wood flew in different directions. The amplifier sparked and went silent. And for just a moment, in the aftermath of that explosion of violence, Kurt felt something like relief, but only for a moment. Because destroying the guitar didn't destroy what he was feeling. It didn't release the pressure building inside him. If anything, it made it worse. Because now, standing on stage with the remains of his instrument in his hands and 15,000 people staring at him in shock and excitement, Kurt realized something terrible. The destruction they'd just witnessed. They loved it. They were cheering, screaming, recording it in their memories as the coolest moment of the show. They'd interpreted his genuine moment of desperation as performance, as punk rock theater, as exactly what they'd come to see from Nirvana. He'd tried to destroy something that was destroying him, and the audience had applauded. Kurt dropped what was left of the guitar and walked off stage. Dave and Chris stopped playing, confused. The crowd's cheers turned uncertain. Stage managers rushed around, trying to figure out what was happening. And Kurt Cobain sat down in the dressing room, put his head in his hands, and tried to remember why he'd started playing music in the first place. Tried to remember a time when it had been about expression rather than expectation, about connection rather than consumption, about meaning rather than money. The show didn't end there. After 10 minutes, Kurt was convinced to return to the stage with a backup guitar. The band finished their set. The crowd went home satisfied, telling their friends about the crazy moment when Kurt smashed his guitar. Reviews of the show mentioned it as a highlight. The destruction became part of Nirvana's legend. Just another example of their raw, unpredictable energy. Just another reason they were the most exciting band in rock music. But backstage, After the audience had left and the venue had emptied out, something had fundamentally changed. Dave and Christ approached Kurt carefully, unsure what to say. They'd seen him destroy equipment before, but this had felt different, more desperate, more real. Kurt sat on a worn couch, staring at nothing, the adrenaline of performance draining away and leaving behind only exhaustion. The guitar tech was cataloging the damage to the destroyed instrument, calculating replacement costs. The tour manager was on the phone with someone, probably dealing with the logistical nightmare of a partially destroyed amplifier. And Kurt was thinking about how he'd just tried to communicate something true and painful, and it had been received as entertainment. That realization would haunt him for the rest of his life. The understanding that anything he did, no matter how genuine or desperate or real, would be filtered through the lens of his persona, that Kurt Cobain the person and Kurt Cobain the icon were becoming separate entities, and the icon was consuming the person, that he could scream his pain into a microphone and people would analyze the lyrics for hidden meanings while missing the obvious fact that he was literally screaming for help, that he could destroy his instruments and his equipment and eventually himself, and some portion of the audience would always interpret it as part of the show. The days following the Paramount show were strange. Nevermind was starting to climb the charts. Radio stations were adding Smells Like Teen Spirit to their playlists. MTV was putting the video in rotation. The machinery of success was grinding into motion, and there was no stopping it. Journalists wanted interviews. Television shows wanted performances. Everyone wanted a piece of Nirvana, wanted to be part of the phenomenon that was clearly building. And Kurt wanted to disappear, wanted to go back to being nobody, wanted to play music in dingy clubs for people who actually understood what he was trying to say. But that world was gone. That version of his life was over, and there was no going back. What nobody talked about in the immediate aftermath of that show, what wouldn't be discussed for years, was what that destroyed guitar represented. It wasn't just an instrument. It wasn't just equipment. It was Kurt's attempt to destroy the expectations that were being projected onto him, to break the mold that the music industry and the media and even his own fans were trying to force him into, to reject the role of spokesman and icon and voice of a generation. But you can't destroy expectations by destroying a guitar. You can't reject a role by walking off stage. The expectations follow you. The role consumes you whether you accept it or not. In the months that followed, as Nevermind became one of the biggest albums in the world, Kurt would destroy many more guitars, each destruction more violent than the last, each one an attempt to communicate something he couldn't put into words, each one received by audiences as performance rather than genuine desperation. He'd smash instruments worth thousands of dollars. He'd set them on fire. He'd throw them into crowds, and every single time, the act of destruction would be celebrated rather than understood, would become part of his legend rather than a warning, sign that something was deeply wrong. Years later, after Kurt's death, people would look back at moments like the Paramount show and see them differently. They'd watch footage of him destroying guitars and recognize the desperation in his eyes. They'd read interviews where he talked about feeling trapped and overwhelmed and realize he wasn't being metaphorical. They'd understand that many of his most celebrated performances were actually moments of genuine crisis that had been misinterpreted as theater. But in real time, in 1991, nobody saw it. Or if they saw it, they didn't know what to do about it. The guitar tech who'd been working with Nirvana that tour would later recall the aftermath of the Paramount show in an interview. He described finding Kurt sitting alone backstage, staring at the pieces of the destroyed guitar. When asked if he wanted them thrown away, Kurt had said something strange. He'd said he wanted to keep the neck, just the neck, not as a trophy or a memento, but as a reminder. When pressed about what he wanted to be reminded of, Kurt had just shaken his head and said it didn't matter. Nobody would understand anyway. The guitar neck ended up in storage somewhere, along with dozens of other pieces of destroyed instruments from other shows, physical evidence of all the times Kurt Cobain had tried to destroy something inside himself by destroying something outside himself. But the real destruction that night wasn't physical. It was the death of whatever small hope Kurt still had that success might make things better. That recognition might fill whatever was empty inside him. That reaching millions of people with his music might create the kind of connection he'd been searching for his entire life. The Paramount show proved otherwise. It proved that you could stand in front of 15,000 people and still be completely alone. That you could scream your pain as loud as possible and still not be heard. That you could literally destroy the tools of your art and have people applaud the destruction without understanding what was being destroyed. That realization would shape everything that came after. Every interview where Kurt seemed uncomfortable or hostile. Every performance where he seemed to be sabotaging himself. Every time he made decisions that seemed designed to alienate his audience or damage his career. He wasn't being difficult or self-destructive for the sake of being difficult or self-destructive. He was testing to see if anyone actually saw him, if anyone understood what he was trying to communicate, if there was any authentic connection possible in a world where everything was filtered through media and mythology and the expectations of millions of strangers. The answer he would discover over the next few years was mostly no. There were individuals who understood, his family to some extent, close friends who knew him before the fame, fellow musicians who'd experienced similar pressures, but the broader world, the millions of fans and critics and industry people who had opinions about Kurt Cobain, they saw what they wanted to see. They interpreted his actions through their own lenses. They made him into whatever they needed him to be. And the real Kurt Cobain, the person underneath the icon, became increasingly invisible even as his fame grew larger. The night of September 25th, 1991, marked the beginning of that invisibility. The moment when Kurt realized that success wouldn't save him, that fame wouldn't heal him, that reaching millions of people wouldn't create the connection he was desperately seeking. And in that realization, something broke inside him that would never fully heal. A crack that would widen over the following years until it became a chasm too wide to cross. When people talk about that show now, they usually focus on the spectacle. The destroyed guitar, the raw energy, the proof that Nirvana was the real deal, not just another manufactured band. They treat it as a positive moment in rock history, an example of punk rock authenticity. But for those who understand what was really happening that night, it's something else entirely. It's the moment when one of the most talented and troubled musicians of his generation tried to communicate his pain in the only way he knew how, and had that communication misinterpreted as entertainment. It's the moment when the gap between Kurt Cobain the person and Kurt Cobain the icon became unbridgeable. It's the beginning of an ending that nobody saw coming but that, in retrospect, seems inevitable. The destroyed guitar from the Paramount show was never repaired. It couldn't be. The damage was too extensive. Some pieces were saved, some were lost. Some ended up in the hands of collectors who paid thousands of dollars for fragments of wood and metal that had once been part of Kurt Cobain's instrument. Those collectors probably thought they were buying a piece of rock history, a tangible connection to a legendary moment. But what they were really buying was evidence. Proof that on one September night in Seattle, a young musician tried to destroy his way out of a trap that was only just beginning to close around him. Tried to break free from expectations that would eventually crush him. Tried to communicate something true in a world that only wanted performance. And in failing to communicate what he was really trying to say, in having his desperate act of destruction celebrated as entertainment, Kurt Cobain learned something that would haunt him until his death. He learned that he could never be truly seen, that the persona had consumed the person, that no matter what he did or said or destroyed, People would interpret it through the lens of what they expected from Kurt Cobain rather than seeing it for what it actually was, a cry for help, a moment of genuine desperation, an attempt to break free from something that couldn't be broken. That was what really happened the night Kurt Cobain destroyed his guitar at the Paramount Theatre. Not punk rock theater, not calculated rebellion, not performance art, just one person trying desperately to communicate something true and discovering that truth gets lost in translation. When you're famous, that authenticity becomes impossible when you're an icon. That the louder you scream, the less anyone actually hears you. And that sometimes the most significant moments in someone's life are the ones that everyone else completely misunderstands.
Wenn du dich jemals gefragt hast, wie du